My name is Martín Sánchez-Jankowski, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. And let me welcome you today to this joint event between ISSI on the one hand and the Center for Poverty and Inequality at Stanford on the other. It's an ongoing collaboration that we have reorganized into one time instead of two times in the previous years, so that we could have somewhat of a conference, a longer dialogue between scholars on each side. So this is the second in that kind of development that we've begun. Our title for the conference today is Rising Tide, Sinking Ships, Climate Change and Inequality, which I think is enormously creative and I think cutting edge, because we often don't think of environmental changes when it affects levels of inequality, or how people even think about inequality. We'll have scholars here today and experts telling us a great deal about the way in which people think about inequality and climate. Before we begin, I want to just remind you, and I'll do this myself, to turn off your cells, because I often tell people and then mine rings. And so please turn off your cells. It's a very small room. It can be disruptive, not to mention embarrassing when you're trying to fuddle around turning it off. Let me describe to you today the format which we will invoke here. That format would be that we will have two speakers in the beginning panel this morning, then we will break for lunch, and then we'll reconvene, in which we will have another two speakers in the afternoon. Each speaker will talk for about 20 minutes, after which we will open it up for discussion and questions. I will try to come back up after I introduce the speaker to take the questions from the person, so I'll set up a queue for people, and then the presenter will answer in relationship to that queue. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker. It is Jon Krosnick. He is Frederic O. Glover Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences at Stanford University. He received his MA and PhD in social psychology from the University of Michigan. He directs the Stanford University's Political Psychology Research Group, and he's a leading international authority on psychology of political attitudes and behavior. And particularly looks at the preferences of how becoming very knowledgeable about emotionally invested in government policy affects people's political thinking and participation. The title of his talk for us this morning is Inequality in Public Opinion on Global Warming. Please join me in welcoming Professor Krosnick.
Just a small change. Disconnect. That's not my slide. Let's try this again. There we go. Good. Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to spend a little time with you. I appreciate your coming out to be part of this exciting event, and I'm glad to be part of it as well. This is a particular turning point for me, and I'm especially grateful to the Center for Poverty and Inequality at Stanford, because I have been doing surveys, as I'll tell you about in a moment, for about 20 years, studying American public opinion on climate change. And this is my first opportunity to collaborate with the center. That, in fact, you can see Ariella Schachter, who's listed there as the first author of this presentation. She is a graduate student in sociology and a remarkable talent at Stanford, and really the lead person who's done the heavy lifting on what I'll share with you today. And this is all possible because of the center. So it just illustrates how centers can create teams that wouldn't otherwise exist. And this conference also inspired that collaboration as well, so I'm grateful for all that. The story that I'd like to tell you about today is our first investigation, as you can see the title there, into the issue of social stratification and inequality with regard to this issue. And there are lots of different ways to think about it. But what I'd like to do is to begin by giving you a little background, painting a portrait of American public opinion on this issue briefly. I could go on for many hours, but I won't. And then what I'll do is tell you about the new research that Ariella has been leading with us, looking at social stratification and its impact on these views. So to begin with, I just want to show you a few quick quotes, just in case you haven't heard this style of thinking. This one from the prestigious publication Science. John Sterman wrote, "The strong scientific consensus on the causes and risks of climate change stands in stark contrast to widespread confusion and complacency among the public." In 2010, Bloomberg Businessweek said the number of Americans who agree the Earth is warming because of man-made activity has been in free fall. That's a dramatic statement. In 2011, The Economist asked, "Why don't Americans believe in global warming?" And in 2012, "The public has caught on and believes the global warming issue is dead," said Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma. So is all of this true? Is it true that Americans have turned away from this issue, that their belief in its existence has been in free fall? Well, the way we answer that question is, of course, by doing scientific surveys. And our surveys that I'll tell you about today have been done between 1997 and 2014. We're launching new ones very soon. These are all representative samples of American adults selected randomly and interviewed by telephone. We call landlines and cell phones. Numbers selected randomly, so every household has an equal probability of participating in the survey. I agonize over writing balanced and unbiased questions and would be happy to tell you about that stuff in the time we have for questions if you like. But I'd like to begin by just looking at a few of what I call the fundamentals. Has warming been happening? Has it been caused by humans? Is it a threat? If the free fall is happening, we would see it here. Here's an example of question wording that we have used. You may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What's your personal opinion on this? Do you think this has probably been happening, or do you think it probably has not been happening? Now, that's a kind of long wording. We've also shortened it a great deal, and it turns out you get the same results from a shorter version. So just think for a second, given the quotes that you heard, your own impressions, what you might have read, what percent of people do you think would say probably has been happening? And now I will show you. So these are the numbers between 1997 and our most recent survey in June 2014. So there are two things to notice here. First of all, these are gigantic numbers. This is America we're talking about. This is a country in which we are typically divided 50-50 on just about everything. 60% is a big majority. And here there's about as much unanimity as you could expect, I think, on this issue. You can see a little rise from the high 70s up to the mid 80s. And then a drop and a bump up, but there's no evidence of free fall here. You can look at this and note some differences. And if you, for example, if you stop doing surveys right here, you would see, oh, maybe that's going to be a free fall someday, but it's not. And as it turns out, this what might look to you like random noise isn't random noise. The up in 2011 and the drop in 2009, it's all, I believe, due to this. So this is annual global temperature between 1950 and 2012. And what, in general, you can see average temperature has been going up for the Earth. And you can also see that 2010 is the tallest bar here. So this was the warmest year on record. And you can also see that there was a notable drop from 2007 to 2008. And in fact, that kind of evidence gets big play in the news. This is the New York Times. Figures on global climate show 2010 tied to 2005 as the hottest year on record. That got revised so that 2010 is the hottest year on record. And this graphic accompanied it, showing readers that average temperature was high at that point. So people know about these data. And so as it turns out, 2010 was a hot year that accounts for this rise. 2008 was a cool year, and it accounts. And in fact, the correlation between this graph and the graph I just showed you is 0.9. It's particularly strong among people who don't trust scientists, it turns out. People who do trust scientists, which is about 70% of the country, they stay steady. but the people who don't trust scientists are looking at these kinds of data and responding to it, actually. This is another of the fundamentals. If the Earth has been warming over the last 100 years, do you think this has been mostly caused by things people have done, mostly caused by natural processes, or about equally by things people have done in natural processes? And these are the percentages of people who have pointed to human activity as being responsible. Again, high numbers and no evidence of free fall. Will warming occur in the future if nothing is done to stop it? Numbers in about the same territory during the years we've asked that question. When we ask people how serious of a problem do you think this will be for the US in the future if nothing is done to stop it? These are the percentages of people who put themselves at the top 2 points on a rating scale that we've offered them. Large numbers, no notable free fall. When we ask about the seriousness for the world as a whole, even higher numbers. So let me just go back and forth here. So the US is just slightly, that's the US, the world, the US, the world, slightly higher for the world. Here's an interesting one. If the Earth's temperature were to rise 5 degrees Fahrenheit 75 years from now, would this overall be good, bad, or neither good nor bad? And here, these numbers are kind of in that mid-60s range on average. The natural scientists say 5 degrees Fahrenheit in 75 years would be horrible. So this might be a place where you'd say, people don't necessarily get it. We're actually just in the field right now doing a survey in Arizona, and what we have found is that I'm leaking data to you that are not going to be public for a while, and wow, I'm being videotaped. But it looks like people in Arizona believe they will be hit much harder by temperature increases than will the world as a whole. And now let me just show you very quickly some results with regard to policy opinions. So in other words, it could be the case that Americans think these problems exist, but government has no role in addressing them. They should be addressed some other way. When we ask people this long question, which I'm not going to read you, about whether government should limit greenhouse gas emissions by businesses, we find 76% of people saying yes. When we ask people about requiring companies that make electricity to make at least 20% from water, wind, and solar power, this was an element of a bill considered by the Congress not long ago, 69% said government should do this. When we asked about government encouraging carbon sequestration by offering tax breaks to companies burning coal to do this, we saw 70% of people in favor. When we asked this long question that I'm not going to read to you about cap and trade, we got 74% of people favoring limiting emissions but allowing companies to trade their allowances to among themselves. And this last batch of policies, when we asked about whether government should either require the following, encourage with tax breaks, or stay out of completely, 77% said that government should reduce greenhouse gas emissions by power plants, which is what President Obama just did with an executive order through the EPA. Building more efficient, energy-efficient cars and more energy-efficient buildings and more energy-efficient appliances, all of which putting out fewer greenhouse gases, are very popular. However, it's not that Americans love everything. As you may know, nuclear power is often talked about as a way to make electricity with no emissions in the greenhouse gas arena. Only 37% of Americans favor government effort to promote the use of nuclear power. And even less popular are retail taxes proposed by economists as a good way to reduce consumption. So the question is, do you think the federal government should increase taxes on gasoline in order to cause people to use less of it? And the same question about electricity. Gasoline tax increase favored by 28% of people, and an electricity tax increase favored by only 25%. Now, if you think about this for a second, you might say, well, obviously this is Americans saying they don't want to pay. They would be happy for these changes to happen if it doesn't cost them anything, but the minute it's going to hit them, they're unwilling to support it. In fact, that's not true. When we look at it in many ways, including telling people that these other policies will cost them and telling them how much it'll cost them, they don't depart. What's really going on here is that Americans support limits. They support mandates that require limiting emissions or incentives to limit emissions. What they don't love is financial incentives where, if the tax on electricity goes up, the only thing we're guaranteed is we'll pay more for electricity. There's no guarantee that greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced. So the lack of guaranteed benefit appears to be the real cause there. So this brings us now to the issue of social stratification. I've shown you everything from a sort of bird's eye view in terms of what Americans think. To what degree do different groups within society feel differently about this? And in the research that we've been doing, we focused, first of all, on education. And I'm going to propose a series of ways in which education might condition answers to these questions. First of all, presumably more educated people have had more exposure to natural science findings and may have a better understanding of the scientific method. So as a result, they might have less skepticism about science, more trust in scientists, and they might also be more exposed to and understand the logic of economic theory. So for all of these reasons, maybe more educated people would be more likely to accept the claims from natural scientists and also would be less resistant to some of the policies that require assumptions. Secondly, you might imagine that income would play quite differently. So wealthier people, who presumably on average are more educated, might have a sense of invulnerability. Like, okay, it gets a little warmer, I turn up the air conditioning, what's the problem? Whereas people who have no air conditioning and who are already existing in very, very hot and unpleasant conditions would be very aware of the impact of more heat. Secondly, you might imagine that high-income people would not be so oriented toward government intervention, that if something happens, they'll just accommodate themselves. They will just buy the air conditioner if they need it. They don't need government to impose regulations to protect them, because they can protect themselves with their money. So at least these are a set of hypotheses that you might imagine would play out. So let me show you what we found when we investigated. Oh, sorry, one other quick one. That it might actually be, if you talk about raising taxes on gasoline, wealthy people say, yeah, fine, I can pay those, it doesn't bother me. So it might be the lower income people who would be especially resistant to those taxes. So just to give you an example of a mediated hypothesis that we explored, so the proposal I made a moment ago was that perhaps education leads to greater trust in scientists, and it's the trust that produces the acceptance of those scientific views. So what Ariel has done is to take all the surveys that we've done over the years, which is about 24,000 respondents in total, stack them up, and do analysis looking at the relations of demographic variables with these opinions. And I'll show you results both from OLS regressions and logistic regressions. So let's begin with the question of whether education appears to cause, or is at least associated with, more acceptance of scientific views on this issue, perhaps mediated by trust in scientists. And I apologize, I'm going to show you these tables in a way you can't read them, but you don't need to read them anyway. I'll tell you what they say. The most important thing is just to, so here's education up here. In fact, let me just get my little pointer. It'll be less awkward. So there is education up here, represented in dummies. The omitted group is the least educated people who have less than high school. And the important thing to look at here is when we don't control for income, you see no asterisks here in predicting whether people think the planet's been warming or not. And when we do control for income, there's a little effect. The very highest group is a little bit more accepting of the belief in warming. But this is, to me, mostly failure for this hypothesis. This coefficient does in fact become non-significant when we control for trust in scientists, which is consistent with the idea that little effect might be mediated by trust. But by and large, education seems not to be playing a powerful role here. Next, we'll look at a regression predicting whether global warming will continue in the future if nothing is done to stop it. And again, if you look across the education dummies here, in each of these regressions, there are no asterisks there. You can see that. It's not happening. There is no stratification with regard to education. What about the belief that global warming has been caused by humans? Now you see lots of asterisks, right? And these are all positive coefficients. What that means is more educated people, especially the highest education group, are most likely to attribute warming to human activity. And there is a notable drop of this coefficient when we control for trust in scientists. So at least with regard to this human causation issue, it looks like education may be playing a role. But that's really, there are very few other instances like it. Here's the question predicting whether global warming will be a serious problem for the country. And you can see sort of, here are some significant coefficients, but the highest group here, the minute you control for income, these effects are gone. You don't need to worry about this because there's no effect of education before we control for trust in scientists. So looks like there is no stratification there. Serious problem for the world, same thing. So there's really convergence across education groups rather than divergence. This is the question about whether 5 degrees of warming would be bad. And again, we see the highest education groups are more likely to embrace that idea. So it looks like human causation and projection of the future in this way is an issue. And these coefficients do get smaller when we control for trust in scientists. So the conclusion is, across this full set of analyses, weak support at best for the idea that education uniformly brings people in line with scientific views on the natural science side. Next hypothesis: does education cause more acceptance of policies based on economic theory? So when you think about incentives, for example, do people who have more education embrace those policies more? We have 2 sets of results on the left-hand side. This is looking at the consumption taxes, and on the right-hand side, these are the tax incentives or mandates. And what you can see is on the left-hand side, yeah, it's true that the most educated group is a little bit more supportive of these policies, and all of the education groups are more supportive of the more complex incentive policies than the least educated group. But again, I guess I look at this as not a dramatic statement that additional education leads to dramatic increases in embracing of either of these points of view. So the conclusion is, yeah, it's there, but it's certainly not, this is not a story about stratification by education. We're coming to the end here, given that my time is limited. Does income cause more resistance to government action? That is, I got lots of money, I don't need government to protect me, I'll take care of myself. And this now, what I'm going to show you is coefficients of income up at the top here. These are the ones we care most about. And what matters is this last column. When we're controlling for education in predicting policy support, the answer is there's no income evidence at all of effects happening here. That more educated people are more supportive of government policy, but income does not seem to lead people to turn away from government involvement. And next is the question of whether income causes less resistance to consumption taxes, where people say, look, I'm wealthy, I can pay the increased taxes on gasoline, that's fine, do it that way. And again, the income coefficients are up at the top, and this is the important one, where we're controlling for education. There is absolutely nothing happening there. So the conclusion I reach is that there's no support for the income hypotheses. To conclude, let me show you quickly what the coefficients look like on other demographics at the bottom of those tables that I didn't focus on, because they are interesting too. There's only one instance in which African Americans and whites differ in all of this analysis. That is that African Americans say that the problem will be more important for the U.S. And that's it. In every other way, there's convergence across whites and African Americans. No other evidence of reliable race or ethnicity differences. Older people, it turns out, are consistently more likely to accept the natural science. I mean, it's almost like if you live long enough to know the colder years, you now can tell that these years are warmer. But there's actually quite the opposite effect. Older people are less supportive of all interventionist policies. And it's almost as if, and we have no explanation for this yet with data, it's as if they say, oh, by the time this plays out, I'll be dead. So, quite consistently across everything we've looked at, men are more accepting of the natural science, which is an interesting point. And this is a notable effect. Men are significantly and substantially more willing to embrace the idea of warming than are women. But men are less supportive of all interventionist policies than women are. Interesting. And lastly, we see some regional differences. that in the Northeast, for some reason, is significantly less likely to accept the natural science than the rest of the country, but they are more supportive of government policies than the rest of the country. Now, we haven't even begun to control for things like party identification or political ideology in this analysis, so this is just purely a demographic approach. But I just wanted you to see what those basic patterns are and where we are set up to, I think, now proceed next. So what conclusions can we reach here? Well, in some ways, you might have been able to guess my bottom line at the end of this talk based on the beginning of the talk. That is, when you have a country where 75 or 80% of people agree on many of the fundamentals, and you know that education has a distribution that doesn't match that. It's not like there are 75% of highly educated people and 25% of uneducated people in some sharp division. That to expect education to be a powerful predictor in a gradual way, it's not so clear that it could work mathematically. And similarly, it's possible that income would play a role, but what we've seen here is, I think, much more convergence across people than divergence in terms of their demographic background. Now, as you know, there is a really, really strong correlate of every single variable I showed you, which is either political party identification or liberal conservative ideology. And you might imagine that there are interesting potential ways to explain that correlation, but I'm going to close with a proposal to suggest that even that is not what it might seem to be. That what you may be aware of is over the last 30 years, the number of Americans who call themselves Republicans, independents, conservatives has changed, such that there used to be a lot more people calling themselves Republicans at the beginning of the Bush administration than do so now. There are now many more people who call themselves independents. And over that time period, the split between Republicans and Democrats in terms of their views on climate change has increased notably. But we believe it's actually not due to individuals changing their minds on the issue of climate change. It looks like it's a sorting process, whereby the only people who remain Republicans are the people who endorse the Republican line of skepticism on the issue. And so actually, the idea that there's been any change at all in Americans' opinions over this time period is inconsistent with the data that we've shown you, and any substantial change to be noted. And so the idea that suddenly Republicans have been moved in one direction and independents have been moved in the opposite direction by exactly the same amount, it seems implausible and seems far more likely that it's this sorting process. So, having said that, thank you for your time, and thank you to the Center for the opportunity to do this work, and we can do discussion.